Hi, I'd like to welcome you to week 2 of the St. Aidan's Institute course on holy living. My hope is you'll watch the two videos on one on Martin Luther and one on the Protestant Reformation, um, because the history is interesting, but really they're asking questions about how people develop holy lives. And while there are the kind of ecclesial fights going on about how the church should be organized, and there are the theological fights going on about what Eucharist is and what salvation is. There's also real meaningful issues about how do we develop a holy life. In the medieval period, we see the rise of three primary groups, and each one takes a very different approach to grappling with this question. The mendicants are beggars. These are people that just wander from place to place begging for food and anything else that they may need, with the idea that by living on the edge of life and death, that is where God will be encountered. And by seeing people in the worst states of their life and in the worst situations of their life, that's where God will most be heard. And so lots of people became mendicants, going out begging for alms, a practice still widely used today in certain branches of Buddhism in Asia, where each monk starts the morning by going out into the community begging for food. And if he doesn't get it, he doesn't eat that day, and then has to reflect upon what is the nature of that and what is the spiritual lesson to be taught. So there's the mendicants. Another form of spirituality that emerged were the scholastics. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps being the most famous of which. And the scholastics really wanted to take a more cerebral and intellectual approach. It was a period where we started to see the rise of universities in Europe for the first time, and people had the leisure of being able to sit and really wrestle with questions of logic, questions of science, questions of God, and the scholastics wanted to bring the three together. What Thomas Aquinas did in the Summa Theologica was to try to bring what was understood at the time as being the best approaches to science, and using that to show just how truthful the claims of Christianity were, and how nature and everything in it proves not only who God is, but what God's plan is for the world and what our role in it is. It can be very complicated reading. St. Bonaventure as well, the journey of the mind to God, and that idea of how we can cerebrally contemplate who God is, what faith is about, and where it is all taking us. The third group kind of is a reaction against the scholastics, and that is the mystics. The mystics weren't looking for a cerebral contemplation of God. They were looking for a heartfelt experience of God. They were looking for rapturous ecstasy and very intense emotions that really defied explanation. And the mystics have a very powerful body of literature that they composed over the centuries. And whenever we saw historically a swing toward the cerebral, there was always that swing back toward the mystical. In Anglicanism, perhaps the best example of it is in the 1700s, after all the fighting in England died down and the Church of England really settled down. It tended toward a cerebral understanding of the faith and became a little too intellectualized. And in the mid-1700s, the counteraction to that was the rise of John Wesley and the whole movement of Methodism, which Wesley describes as beginning, after having been a Christian for many years, his journey began at a prayer meeting at Aldersgate, where he wrote later that he felt his heart strangely warmed by the experience. And the rise of Methodism, which became popular in England but wildly popular in the United States in the 1800s, was really that seeking of an emotional encounter with God, but not giving up too much of the liturgical forms and structure of Anglicanism. You may or may not know this, but Wesley was himself an Anglican priest and died as an Anglican priest, not as the leader of a separate denomination. But anyway, that rise really reflected it. Now today's Methodism is nothing like what was known way back then. Perhaps what you would see in a Nazarene church or Church of God church, Wesleyan denominations that are a little more conservative and a little more Arminian or a little more heart-driven are reflected there. Another American example, if you want to see a major fight going on in a denomination today, another major example would be the Southern Baptist Convention, which swung wildly toward fundamentalism and a really hardcore Calvinism, something known as 5-point Calvinism or tulip Calvinism, where things were very, very cerebrally driven, and the focus was on memorization of Scripture and intense theological arguments. And that is now swinging the other way. And now half the people in the Southern Baptist Church would not consider themselves Calvinists, but would consider themselves Arminians, which is the theological school of John Wesley. And so there's a much greater sense on the feeling of the heart and kind of charismatic type stuff. So our first question of the week is really grappling with these different approaches to spirituality and what constitutes holy living. Now, you're not going to grapple with what's considered the best and what's considered the worst. That's a nonsensical either-or argument that doesn't really help. What instead I want you to do is to grapple with what resonates with you the most. What do you find most comfortable and what feels closest to home for you? Because part of developing a holy life is understanding what pattern of spiritual life resonates in you the most, because that'll be the way in which God is speaking to you. And then developing your spiritual walk and helping others develop their spiritual walk based on how God is speaking to them is going to be very important. If you're a charismatic and you're working with someone who's a scholastic or kind of an intellectual, you guys will never be able to talk on the same level. It's two very different ideas. So for you as a scholar of St. Aidan's, you want to be able to recognize that and help the people you work with find the mode that works with them and help them develop that mode, whether or not it has any relation to the mode in which you approach God and work on your own growth. So that's the first question. The second one is to look at kind of the major Protestant reformers, which came just after this period, the medieval period, and look not at their theology, but at their spirituality. How do they see we go toward God? How do they see us as approaching and understanding God? Because being able to do so will add a lot more insight into why they did the other things they did in terms of theology. So I'm making a long video today. You've got 2 other videos to watch. If you haven't got the textbook yet, do a little digging on your own on these topics. At least get a Wikipedia understanding of the reformers and of these different schools of spirituality. And we should have a good, fruitful discussion this week. Hopefully by the end of this week we'll all have our books and get caught up and really be able to start flying forward. We have to get good at this. We have to really be grounded in this, because when we come to Martin Thornton and the English spirituality, without having a really solid foundation in what has gone on elsewhere, you're going to miss some of the richness of what he's describing. So good luck this week. Have a great week. God bless you, and I'll see you in the classroom.